Welcome to Books and Bridges, a humanities forum of ideas and conversation. Our mission is to bring literatures of the world into dialogue, to deepen the discourse of our culture, and to build friendship on common loves instead of common hates. You can find our discussions on booksandbridgesforum.org and our essays at eclective.substack.com. It has been 1 year since Cormac McCarthy died, the author who wrote with jagged beauty and entrancing depth, left us with a body of work that expands our understanding of the human puzzle. We honor this occasion by discussing one of his most philosophical and challenging works, The Crossing. Here, McCarthy offers no easy answers and spares no crack in the moral landscape. Yet in his writing, we see something of the hard grace of nature. We learn to witness the stories of other people, to stand against the void of suffering, to wrestle the crosscurrents of character. Our panel includes two scholars with an abiding love for the natural world, a sense of stewardship for the kinds of landscapes that McCarthy describes in this book. Scott Abbott received his PhD from Princeton University. For over 40 years, he has taught collectively at Princeton, Vanderbilt University, Brigham Young University, and now Utah Valley University, where he is professor of literature and philosophy. His books include a study of Freemasonry and the German novel, a series of fraternal meditations, conversations on bikes and botany, 3 co-authored works with Serbian novelist Žarko Radaković, an exploration of the meanings of barbed wire with historian Lynn Bennett, and a collection of essays on academic freedom and the idea of a university. He has translated works by Nobel Prize awardee Peter Handke and botanist Gregor Mendel. George Handley received his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. He taught at Northern Arizona University for 3 years and has taught at Brigham Young University for over 25 years, where he is professor of Environmental Humanities. His publications include Post-Slavery Literatures in the Americas, New World Poetics, Nature and the Adamic Imagination of Whitman, Neruda, and Walcott, Home Waters, A Year of Recompenses on the Provo River, and is currently working on a book called From Chaos to Cosmos, Literature as Eco-Theology. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be here, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan.
Scott, we will go ahead and listen to you first. This is just a panel format. Scott Abbott will speak first, give his remarks. Dr. George Handley will give his remarks. And then after that, we'll open it up for some discussion between the three of us, and then open it up for the viewers to submit questions through the Q&A button. So take it away, Scott.
All right, I'll begin with Cormac McCarthy's assertion in the Kekulé problem that, quote, the simple understanding that one thing can be another thing is at the root of all things of our doing. Our lives, our actions, our understandings, McCarthy argues, have metaphor at their root. We forge our identities through the metaphor we use, and one of the most interesting and extensive of those metaphors is the metaphor of standing. It's evident in the STA root in a couple of words that I'll read. Listen for the STA sound. Nietzsche said we forget that these metaphors exist. We just use the words like blank coins. So this may surprise you. Existence, understanding, ecstasy, stasis, state, constant, and even obstetrics. These are just a few of the hundreds of words that employ the standing metaphor to make sense of time and space, of our existence and our identities, of the world itself. So what makes this particular metaphor so useful? My answer today will come from 4 of Cormac McCarthy's books, The Road, and then the 3 books of the Border trilogy. All 4 of them use the metaphor to explore their characters' interactions with the world. Earlier and later novels, Blood Meridian and No Country for Old Men, for instance, don't pay any attention at all to this metaphor. So there's something about special about the Border trilogy, maybe the crossings in that trilogy that bring the metaphor out. And then a look at the road just as an introduction here. So if you've read it, you know that the father and the son make their way through a disordered, dying, and dangerous world that's described again and again in entropic terms. Here's just one, like the onset of some cold glaucoma dimming away the world. 19th century physicist James Maxwell posited an active daemon to retain order in an entropic system tending to disorder. And the father in the road acts like that daemon, acutely aware of the world's increasing physical and moral heat loss, and yet utterly committed to protecting his son. A passage early in the book highlights the devastation and the father's desperate desire for order. Nathan, you'll remember in your last episode, you read this, and I hadn't seen it before, but it's perfect for this topic. He rose and stood tottering in that cold, autistic dark with his arms outheld for balance. An old chronicle, to seek out the upright. No fall, but preceded by a declination. He took great marching steps into the nothingness, counting them against his return. Eyes closed, arms oaring. Upright to what? Something nameless in the night, load or matrix. Deathly ill, cold and undernourished, standing in the dark is precarious for the tottering father. The narrator shifts from that old chronicle of physical declination and fall to standing in an expanded sense, to uprightness as knowing, to standing as key to the transcendent order of some nameless load or matrix. Physical standing is a material repudiation of entropy and is such a ready metaphor. Standing is also a standing for. And now to the crossing, which is our main topic today. Standing metaphor opens the crossing, closes it, and dominates important scenes throughout. Crossing borders between wolf and human, between wilderness and civilization, between order and disorder, between kindness and violence, between meaning and meaninglessness. Billy Parham encounters forces that both threaten and enhance his existence. He stands on ground at once blessed and fraughtful. He experiences opposition that imposes limits. He stands opposed to the void. He stands witness. He withstands the perilous crossings that profoundly test and reveal and shape his being in the world. The novel wastes no time establishing the standing metaphor as thematically important. Billy goes out to see wolves running on the plain in a winter's night. Loping and twisting, dancing, loping and running and rising by twos in a standing dance and running on again. He could feel the presence of their knowing that was electric in the air. Then they stopped. They stood with ears cocked, some with one forefoot raised to their chest. They were looking at him. He did not breathe. They did not breathe. They stood. Then they turned and quietly trotted on. The Crossing is a long novel, dense with this metaphor. I'll give just a couple of examples, each related to Billy Parham's desire to experience another world, a world burning on the shore of an unknowable void, a world of hidden geometries and their orders, which would only stand fully revealed in darkness and ashes. First example, traveling with the wolf and then the wolf's death offer a gateway to the shore of an unknowable world. She is taken from Billy and eventually chained in a ring to fight a succession of dogs. Near the end, Billy steps into the ring with the wolf. She stood spraddled-legged with her sides heaving. He could not pull the stake, and he rose and turned and took hold of the actual wolf by the collar and unsnapped the swivel hook and drew the bloody and slobbering head to his side and stood. The wolf stood against Billy's thigh. The boy stood holding the wolf. He stood holding the wolf. He shoots the wolf rather than allowing her to be torn to pieces by two waiting Airedales. Having stood with the wolf and then tasting her blood, which tasted no different than his own, she is no longer of another world entire for Billy. In this moment, he reached to hold what cannot be held, but which cannot be held, never be held. Standing with the wolf, standing for the wolf, Billy senses what cannot be known. Second example, there's a man who loses his family to an earthquake, which reduces him, the narrator says, to some brevity of a being. He comes to the broken transept of a church. Quote, what remains of it stands on three legs, so to speak, unquote. The so to speak reinforces the novel's insistence on experience mediated always by metaphor. That he chooses to live under the perilous ruin contrasts with the local priest whose religion makes God manageable. This is a quotation, a long one. The old man, by whatever instinct, stood on ground at once blessed and fraughtful. This was his choice, this his gesture, for that is always the nature of such ground, perilous and transitory. He understood what the priest could not, that what we seek is the worthy adversary. We long for something of substance to oppose us. Otherwise, there were no boundaries to our own being. And we too must extend our claims until we lose all definition, until we must be swallowed up at last by the very void to which we wished to stand opposed. Martin Heidegger, whose work McCarthy studied, makes a similar point in his introduction to metaphysics. But this standing there, this taking and maintaining a stand that stands erected high in itself, is what the Greeks understood as being. Whatever places itself into and thereby enacts its limit and thus stands as shape. Billy is shaped by these existential experiences. Third example, Billy encounters a group of traveling actors. And the next morning after their play, walking on a bridge, he has a revelation that makes me smile every time I read it. He stood looking down at the clear, cold waters. 100 feet away, in water to her thighs, stood the prima donna naked. He stood frozen. He took off his hat and stood with his heart laboring under his shirt. She bent once more and trailed her hair in the water with a swaying motion sideways, and then stood and swung it about her in a great hoop of spray and stood with her head back and her eyes closed. She opened her eyes and saw him there on the bridge, and she turned her back and walked slowly up out of the river and was lost to his view among the pale standing trunks of cottonwoods. And the sun rose, and the river ran as before, but nothing was the same, nor did he think it ever would be. Time stands still for the man on the bridge, and then the sun and river begin to move again. This is a blessed moment of duration, of stasis, still standing. Fourth example, Billy's conversation with a blind man, violently robbed of his sight, ends with an assertion regarding order and disorder. Even this man may be appalled at what is revealed to him and seek some order to stand against it. This man of which we speak will seek to impose order and lineage upon things which rightly have none. He will call upon the world itself to testify as to the truth of what are in fact but his desires. Absent a desire to impose order, McCarthy depicts a perilous world. The order he creates through the standing metaphor is always contingent. Standing has no meaning except in the context of entropy. Billy stands with the doomed wolf. The old man lives meanfully in the perilous ruined church. Billy stands in the room where his parents were murdered, stands and stands and stands, and finally fell to his knees in the floor and sobbed into his hands. The prima donna moves on, reveling acronyms. Billy's brother Boyd disappears, leaving him newly aware of this enmity of the world for all who have no longer cause except themselves to stand against it. The Trinity test augurs unimaginable destruction. Each encounter sets limits, boundaries, something of substance to oppose. Standing opposed to the void, Billy stands firm as a witness. Where else but through a witness could the world have its being? Where else could Billy Parham achieve anything? Could Billy Parham achieve being but as a witness? After his final border crossing, Billy takes shelter from the rain in one of 3 ruined buildings that recall the ruined church standing on 3 legs. A dog enters the room, an arthritic and ill-joined thing that crabbed sideways. It stood there inside the door, and it was wet and wretched and so scarred and broken that it might have been patched up out of parts of dogs by demented vivisectionists. It stood and turned 3 times and lay down. Billy chases it away, then calls for it when he wakes up in the false dawn of the Trinity test. After our scrutiny of the standing metaphor throughout the novel, the gestures of the final lines take on new meaning. He called and called, standing in that inexplicable darkness, where there was no sound anywhere save only the wind. After a while, he sat in the road. He took off his hat and placed it on the tarmac before him, and he bowed his head and held his face in his hands and wept. He sat there for a long time, and after a while the east did gray, and after a while the right and God-made sun did rise, once again for all and without distinction. That's it.
Thank you, Scott. That was a very thorough examination of the standing metaphor. One thing you may not know about Scott is that he's been working on this study for several years and promises a book from this metaphor. It's going to be brilliant. I know. It's going to be great. I've been waiting for it for a long time. Thank you very much, Scott. Now let's move to George, and he will give his remarks.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. And thank you, Scott. Yeah, Scott and I discovered our common love of this book and went to lunch some time ago to talk about it some more. And it's lovely to find, others who feel the same way about McCarthy, but also about this book in particular. I get asked a lot, which is my favorite McCarthy book. And I mean, it's hard. I think he wrote a great number of brilliant books, but for a variety of reasons, this one has just always stuck with me. My approach to this book comes from I've finished a book that will be coming out in just a couple of weeks. And you alluded to the title. The title is actually slightly different. It's Literature and Eco-Theology from Chaos to Cosmos, and it's a study of why and how in the age of climate change and anthropogenic change, we can and need to read literature for its eco-theological wisdom. And I think of McCarthy as someone who has a considerable amount of eco-theological wisdom. One thing that's not, maybe not super well known about him, because not much is known about him at all. He was very sort of quiet about his literary influences and wasn't prone to giving many interviews, but he was very influenced by a number of important writers that we all know. Melville, Cervantes, Don Quixote was very important to him. And he wrote a play called Of Whales and Men, which sort of has this interesting echo with Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, but it also has an interesting echo with Moby Dick. And he also, actually, I'm sorry, I think I actually said the title wrong. It's it is Of Whales and Men. But he had also a very significant encounter with Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, in which Leopold describes a really kind of crucial conversion moment for him, where he shoots a wolf that turns out to be breastfeeding her pups, and he has this sort of horrific realization of what he's done. And Barry Lopez's book about wolves was also extraordinarily influential on McCarthy. So I'll just focus on sort of that an early scene, although we could have a conversation about the dog at the end that Scott alluded to, because I think that raises so many interesting questions. But this, at the beginning of early part of the novel, he has this sort of encounter with the wolves that leads him into these crossings that Scott was alluding to. And the thing about McCarthy as someone who's interested in nature is he's not willing to portray nature as inherently harmonious, as benign, as offering any kind of comforting home for human beings. In fact, the more he looks into the ecological heart of things, the more complex the world seems, the more evasive it is of our full understanding. It seems to be inherently chaotic and very violent, and certainly beyond our capacity to control. But it does seem to call us, I would argue, to a certain kind of compassionate living, which, we might consider to be a kind of stewardship. Certainly, Billy is motivated out of care for the wolf. And that stems from his early experience. I'll read this passage. This is when he's observing them late at night and under the moonlight. He saw them coming, loping and twisting, dancing, tunneling their noses in the snow, loping and running and rising by twos in a standing dance and running on again. There were 7 of them, and they passed within 20 feet of where he lay. He could see their almond eyes in the moonlight. He could hear their breath. He could feel the presence of their knowing that was electric in the air. They bunched and nuzzled and licked one another, some with one forefoot raised to their chest. They were looking at him. He did not breathe. They did not breathe. They stood. Then they turned and quietly trotted on. There's the standing again. Overwhelmed by reverence, he doesn't tell his brother what he saw. Indeed, he never told nobody, as the narrator says. So at the time, as I mentioned, that he was writing The Crossing, McCarthy was drafting this screenplay called Of Whales and Men. In a crucial debate about ethical treatment of animals in this play, in which one character, Guy, pleads for a less utilitarian view, his colleague Peter responds and says, quote, "Language is a way of containing the world. A thing named becomes that named thing. It is under surveillance. We were put into a garden and we turned it into a detention center." So this is a very instrumentalist view of nature that Peter is trying to contrast with something else. And he stresses the need to be with animals, to coexist and experience them beyond utility, even aesthetic or even ecological utility, so as to learn a deeper kind of love that is de-selfed. And Peter articulates the human relationship to nature as a kind of fall from paradise that begins with this impulse to name and contain. So he suggests that it is really a failure to understand the limitations of language to communicate a reality or a deep knowledge which lies beyond it, including the essence of an animal's experience of itself. This is an important point of comparison because Billy experiences this kind of coexistence that Peter is advocating. It is a moment that intimates a shared being with the wolves, facilitated by the stillness of his own body and mind, right? You can hear him sort of literally not breathing anymore. Significantly, however, his stillness doesn't grant him access to some sort of actuality of wolfness, right? To the very being of the wolf, nor does it give him entry into a complete knowledge of ecological complexity. His ecological imagination nevertheless exposes a gap between his own consciousness and the world of the wolves. His stillness intimates enough of a moral sense to haunt him for the rest of his life and motivate his later compassionate and ethical response to the wolf's suffering. It's not uncommon for readers to assume that McCarthy's constant insistence on the invisibility of any world beyond human language and individual consciousness is a declaration of maybe some kind of material naturalism. But it's also is interesting that he's as skeptical of our ability to understand what lies beyond the material world as he is of our ability to know what is the material world, right? It isn't just that God or metaphysical realities remain beyond the reach of language. It's the very physical world that evades us, even though it is also undeniably real. And the saving grace of this linguistic limit for McCarthy is the way in which that weakness that's expressed in language brings readers into a space of shared vulnerability and woundedness with the world. Language fails to cross the gap between the self, the conscious self, and the world. But McCarthy would have us see that narrative does more than seek to name and detain and control, like his character, Peter, was alluding to. It makes a world. Language, in other words, is not mimetic necessarily or only. It is also poetic. It makes worlds. And these worlds are worlds in which the speaker and the listener are implicated. One critic, Lydia Cooper, who's a brilliant scholar of McCarthy, says that for McCarthy, narrative is a rickety vehicle we ride in order to arrive back at our pre-lingual knowledge of each other, the world, and how to be right or to make right choices in it. Now, this is a lovely summary, I think, of McCarthy. In other words, and I would say in the Anthropocene, in the age of climate change, narrative needs to assume a kind of metaphysical seriousness as something that can help us live right in the world, or at least recover the metaphysical seriousness it once had. We cannot escape an encounter with the very mystery of the cosmos, even when we're just trying to contemplate a landscape or an animal. One of the beautiful lines in the book says, "In the end, we shall all of us only be what we have made of God." And we might say in the same breath with McCarthy that we are only in the end what we make of a wolf, right? Or even if what we end up looking at is the work of our own hands. That is not to say that we are merely caught in some prison house of language. Any reading of McCarthy's representations of the wolf must acknowledge how much more present the wolf is to Billy and to us in the very moment that the wolf seems beyond reach. And the unknowability of the wolf, in other words, is an effect of McCarthy's language. Nature's otherness is itself McCarthy's own linguistic cultural construct. It's brilliant, but it is a cultural construct. So as Lydia Cooper similarly puts it, the narrative underscores not what she thinks, the wolf, which would anthropomorphize her, but that she thinks, that she observes, and that her instincts, her unconscious response. That's an interesting way to see what McCarthy's doing in these scenes. And yet this consciousness of the wolf that McCarthy's language intimates and her tangible physical presence seem at odds. Later, when Billy encounters this dying man who compares the wolf to a snowflake and insists that it will dissipate even as you hold it, he says, "The wolf is made the way the world is made. You cannot touch the world. You cannot hold it in your hand, for it is made of breath only." This is a fascinating sort of metaphysical and simultaneously material argument about the world. Normally, language of mysticism and religion is now applied to the material world, which brings body and spirit into the same kind of problem. It leaves us with language that is simultaneously poetic and mimetic. And then we have what the ex-priest says to him, which I think is really telling of where language starts to go, or how it becomes this sort of poetic function for McCarthy. This is what the ex-priest says to Billy. He says, "There are different worlds, you must agree. Yet even so, there is but one world, and everything that is imaginable is necessary to it. For this world also, which seems to us to be a thing of stone and flour and blood, is not a thing at all, but is a tale. and all in it is a tale, and each tale the sum of lesser tales, and yet these are also the self-same tale, and contain as well all else within them. So everything is necessary, every least thing. This is the hard lesson. Nothing can be dispensed with, nothing despised, because the seams are hid from us, you see, the joinery, the way in which the world is made. We have no way to know what could be taken away, what omitted. This is a fascinating description of how, if you think about novels as worlds in which every word, every detail is made necessary to everything else, right? That is what makes it feel to us as if it were a world. And the thing that brings it together is the storytelling, and that's the joinery, right? It's almost like the glue, right, that brings things, discrete things, into a coherence that we would call a world. And once we're in that world, compassion becomes a meaningful act. Compassion is itself an act of imagination whereby the experience and story of another, human or non-human, is witnessed as real. And I think Scott's right to focus on witnessing. It's not an experience in which information or content is downloaded, but one in which a momentarily disassociated thing pleads for belonging, and through the compassionate imagination finds that belonging, the compassionate imagination becoming the joinery, the thing that seams things together. It brings the consciousness of a wolf into the consciousness of a young man and creates the illusion of one world that can neither be ignored, even if that world is also not entirely visible, or at least detainable. The seams, in other words, must be artful. Compassionate listening and joining must be artful enough to give us the hope of transcendence, even if it's not a guarantee, without losing sight of the fact that we're the ones who are sort of doing the hoping. We're the ones who are creating the sense of wholeness in the world. In this sense, we could say compassion is a form of faith that suspends one's own disregard and disbelief in the face of the other and allows the possibility that two worlds can become one. This is faith that McCarthy signifies when the ex-priest insists that all tales are one. Rightly heard, he says, all tales are one. That's interesting. Rightly heard implies a certain kind of compassionate listening that allows a story to become part of the world. I will note that this is precisely the point of divergence between critics who read McCarthy as an atheist and those who see him as seriously invested in theology. I think I'm a little more in the latter camp, but mainly I see this as a false choice, in part because too often believers and non-believers reduce faith to propositions as if it were an assertion of reality, when in fact it is more of an agonized struggle with ambivalence that, with imagination, decides to settle on hope, a process that has a striking resemblance to what it takes to create art in the first place. I think this is why it's significant that McCarthy insists that the condition of transcendent hope is a story rightly heard. The uncertainty of the storytelling venture is precisely the allure that pulls it forward, because even though the witness to the suffering of another can never really know that suffering, it can imagine that possibility and offer language in order to remake the world. If the gap is unbridgeable, compassion means nothing. And since we experience compassion as meaningful, to give ourselves over in the act of listening and giving compassion, compassion gives us hope to believe that stories matter and perhaps even have the power to remake the world, especially after it's been broken or damaged by, nuclear power or climate change or individual violence to an individual animal. As imagined worlds in which every detail becomes necessary to the whole, stories are practices in compassion and interrelation, where we are taught to see in limited and contingent and small worlds that nothing should be omitted and everything is necessary, which is, of course, an important law of ecology. The natural world and lived experience offer little by way of definitive evidence of the hand of God in the world, in McCarthy's stories, but God cannot be banished to unnecessity, since our reaching for the possibility of God is the same thing as our reaching for wholeness and interconnectedness in the stories we tell. This literary and imagined sense of the cosmos certainly seems to parallel, maybe even mimics, the interconnectedness and wholeness, however troubled, of the natural world. In that sense, we could say that the meaning of stories provides not so much evidence of God as the grounds for metaphysical possibility, for believing that that web of interconnection in the natural world means our imagining of coherent meaning isn't a lie, even if we have to continue to tell stories without definitive corroboration that they, in fact, mimic reality. So we have to live with reasonable doubt. And let me just conclude with this potent statement from the ex-priest who says to Billy, "Deep in each man is the knowledge that something knows of his existence. Something knows and cannot be fled nor hid from. To imagine otherwise is to imagine the unspeakable." So I'll stop there and we can talk.
Well, thank you, George. That was a brilliant analysis as well. So we have here two perspectives, very rich perspectives on a single novel. And as I listened to your presentations, I thought of ways to connect your presentations together. And what I see happening is with the act of standing in defiance of metaphysical uncertainty, standing in defiance of entropy, physical entropy, and the act of caring for the environment, the act of being an agent of care towards the world, the physical world around you. Both of those acts require attentiveness. They require attention. And I think you could even argue there's a whole ethics of attention that we could talk about, especially as it applies to the act of witnessing, listening to another person, being willing to carry on their story, being willing to imbibe their story. But to do any of this, it requires a certain kind of attentiveness, focus on one thing as opposed to another thing. What do you think about attention as a way of joining your two, or connecting your two presentations?
So attentiveness requires that stillness, perhaps, that standing, that attention to the connection with the other. Those are all involved. Attentiveness. It's an incredible narrator, isn't it? Who makes Billy so attentive to so many things. It opens our eyes. I mean, George alluded to this also involves the listeners and the readers. We're in this web of narration, and maybe that's one of the reasons some of us like this novel so much, is it makes us more attentive.
Yeah, I wonder, Scott, I was thinking that Billy's lying down actually when he's paying attention to the wolves, and the wolves are described as standing. And that's also the moment where he's, even holds his breath. So I mean, I don't know, I'm just sort of playing with this idea, but I think he has to kind of de-self himself, right, to really pay attention. And I think, of course, that's kind of fundamental to most Eastern philosophy and teachings about mindfulness, that attention is a really crucial skill, and one of its effects, or maybe it's a chicken and the egg kind of thing, but it real attention becomes possible because there's a momentary loss of the self or self-consciousness. One is not sort of in one's own prison of self-consciousness and is instead experiencing something outside of oneself. But then he has to sort of maybe, I don't know, I'm just playing with the metaphor of standing for a moment here. If he's lying down to pay attention, but then he has to do something with what he's witnessed. And maybe, I don't know if that becomes his standing, that there's a,
Yeah, when he goes out and finds the wolf in his
yeah,
trap, the wolf is standing and he is standing, and there's a lot of standing that goes on there. But there's a moment, and you've just made me aware of it by what you just said, where he has to get down with the wolf. He
yeah,
and the
he's
wolf,
right on the ground. Yeah.
they have to both be there. It's incredibly dangerous for Billy, but until he leaves that standing posture and gets down with the wolf to finally wrestle it into some kind of submission, that's interesting. But then you've also made me jump back to that scene in the dogfighting ring where he stands by and with the wolf, and that feels to me like the most attentive moment of
Mm,
all. And
yeah.
maybe I'm putting too much weight on it, but that wolf is dangerous, and he's never had it not on a lead or a collar before. Uh, but he takes it off, and then they stand, and then they stand and they stand, and the fact that he finally has to kill the wolf and then carry it up into the mountain, and he holds its head. This what you're describing as this feeling for the other, he holds that head, the dead wolf's head, and that's when he has the sense for that maybe there's something beyond, and it's not language, as you pointed out. I think that's really important for the whole discussion. Language separates. Um, anyway, it's
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think there's I mean, yeah, I don't think a kind of stewardship is possible without that attention, because otherwise, I think what Billy might have been motivated to care for, or what any one of us might be motivated to care for, isn't really something other or than ourselves, right? We may actually be standing for or trying to be stewards over something that really is just our own projection or our own ego, or our own human-centeredness that's getting in the way. I mean, I just find, at least in terms of environmental thinking, that there's something so instructive that McCarthy starts the whole story out with this young boy going to such great lengths to pay attention and not anthropomorphize, not it's very different from the whole thing that got him started in the first place, which is these wolves have to be controlled so that our cattle can, it's sort of he's in an economy at first,
yeah.
and he's learning that economy, but then he really has to learn being, right? Just existence with, or coexistence with the world. And then once he gets that, then he can go into this relationship of responsibility. I read one critic who was just so harshly critical of Billy as this sort of silly Christian steward, and that he was like an example of Christian dominionism. And I thought, oh my gosh, just because he feels this sense of responsibility doesn't mean that he's like a wise use, dominionist who wants to like exploit nature for human gain. In fact, he's so willing to act as a steward that he's willing to die, or certainly, as you point out, to put his life at risk, right? He's not, there's nothing he's protecting, he's giving up everything, right? If anything, that's the, sort of the loss of self is the Christian call, right? That he's answering, if you want to think of it that way. But anyway, I was really shocked that at least to some critics, that was seen as a negative, that they saw it as sort of a juvenile, kind of sense of stewardship over the world that McCarthy was sort of dismissing. And I thought, no, I couldn't think of a.
That makes no sense. What about the dog at the end? Oh, we both mentioned it. So there he is, sheltering from the rain, and that dog tries to come shelter with them. In my mind, well, it made no sense to me first that he would kick the dog out, that he would throw rocks and get a pipe and all of that, because what has he learned with the wolf after all? But then I'm wondering if the terrible shape that the dog is in doesn't remind him of the terrible shape he's in after all these crossings, and he doesn't want to think of that. But when he sleeps and wakes the next morning, he has a very different understanding. So what do you think is going on with that?
Well, maybe I was, certainly reading the novel through the lens of the Anthropocene and anthropogenic change in the world. He's obviously not dealing with climate change, but McCarthy was certainly very disturbed by nuclear testing. And I think the fact that that's he witnesses the Trinity test. I think of the dog as sort of the anthropogenic wolf, right? The dog is now, this is the, descendant of the wild wolf. It's the anthropogenically changed animal that is now a man's best friend, so to speak, and yet it's a damaged anthropogenic animal. It's totally brutalized, and so I kind of saw him kind of thinking about, what is our relationship, not just to the wild at the beginning of the book, but what is our relationship to the anthropogenic world now with the nuclear bombs going off, and now the sort of, and I think his first reaction, I think he, essentially regrets it, right? I think that's right. Why he's weeping at the end is that he realizes that he made precisely that mistake, that dog is him, that dog is his world, that dog is our world. And he has to keep being compassionate now, not only to these beautiful wild animals, but now he has to learn compassion in relationship to this hideousness. This, it's like a Frankenstein monster walks in, right? But I don't think it's insignificant that it's a dog, right? So it is an animal that has a genealogical connection to the wolf that motivated the whole story. And but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think he's been cast out just like the dog has, right? I mean, he's been mistreated and misunderstood and discarded as well. Some people maybe could have argued, and maybe it's justified, that Billy's, too good to be true in a lot of ways. But he's certainly deeply moving to me, so I don't really care. It's so authentic and so sincere, I guess, that it doesn't. In fact, I think that his youth is part of what makes him believable. There's a kind of naivete to him that I find very moving. Anyway, that's probably I probably said what I needed to say, but I think of it in terms of that question of anthropogenic change, and how do we now respond to a world that's not, because we could start yearning for the untouched nature, and if the wolf is the only thing that Billy can care about, or if wilderness is the only thing we can care about, but we can't care about cities, or we can't care about, chicken farms, then we're screwed.
So that in my mind, and I may be changing it, as you're saying, he's weeping because of what he's done to the dog. I think that makes sense, but it's that same parallel weeping that he did when he found the bloody mattress where his parents had been murdered. The scenes are set up the same. He stands and stands, and here he stands first, and then he sits down and weeps. And so it may be, he may be responding to the dog, but could he also be responding to the nuclear flash that's just turned the night into day? And if that's going on, and if this scene also parallels some of the other really vicious, horrible things that he's experienced, that he's had to stand, that have involved the standing that I talked about. What if there's no difference between that Trinity test and the murder of his parents, or the destruction of the wolf? I mean, we're talking about the void, and our response, his responses to the most horrible things imaginable, or what shape him, what make him, what give him the empathy that you're talking about, when it could do just the opposite, obviously. Anyway, I'm just
Yeah.
rethinking that end.
Well, we know William Faulkner was very influential on him, and you may remember William Faulkner's famously very brief Nobel speech, which was only one paragraph, and he basically said in the speech, he's alluding to nuclear war, and he says, now that it's possible for us to annihilate ourselves, our only hope is in this puny, inexhaustible human voice that is bearing witness to human experience. It's this extraordinary statement of hope, but also an extraordinary condemnation of human civilization for its self-harm and its harm to the world. So I can only imagine that, and because of his experience in Santa Fe and his knowledge of the science behind nuclear weapons and so on, that McCarthy was deeply, I mean, his last two novels also, are centered around this question of nuclearization. But I think there's this this anxiety about what that means and how damaging it is. Like the God-made son phrase, right, is sort of that he's paraphrasing the New Testament about the what is it, the sun and the rain, they fall upon the sun rises for everybody, the rain falls upon it for everybody. There's something Jesus is describing as a kind of divine neutrality when it comes to the way nature functions. But he had earlier witnessed a sun that was not God made, right? This is an anthropogenic sun that is now competing with the God made one. And so I think he's just, really wrestling with what has happened now that we've transformed the world so profoundly. But I think ultimately he's saying, and I think that's also partly what The Road is all about, is like, the same courage that is required for human civilization to survive is still required for us to get through this. It's just that the stakes are that much higher and the damage is that much more hideous and much more pervasive. But we cannot get tired of the call to stand up and live right in the face of these terrible things. Otherwise, we are doomed.
That three-legged church and the Trinity explosion share that number three, and the dog turned around three times, and he's in a ruin, one of three houses. And I like the way you just said it. So this goes on, and every new challenge, every new opening of the void requires us to stand opposed to it, to witness and to narrate. Yeah, I love what you said about narration. It's hard for me to pull apart what is said about God and what is said about narration. They keep overlapping in interesting ways.
Yeah.
If I could jump in there and just ask a question. Speaking of narration, the priest in the chapel repeatedly talks about how there's really only one story. All all the stories that human beings tell fit under the larger category of one single story. And then Billy asks the question, he says, well, what is that story? And the priest never really answered him. What do you think that one story is? What do you think he's talking about? Is it possible to articulate?
Nathan, it's so hard for me to keep the two characters, the ex-priest, the old man, the anchorite. I mean, they have different names and they have different versions of things, and it's easy to quote what one of them says to support one sense for God and the world, and the other one. So I'm going to let George answer that question.
It's not fair, because I was having the same thought. I mean, I don't know if that, and I actually can't remember if that's the same. Is that the same passage that where, or the same moment where he gives this answer about there is but one world and everything that is imaginable is necessary to it?
Yeah, that
Yeah,
same section. Yeah.
My interpretation, I mean, I think that's one of the most important passages in literature, period, but it's certainly one of the most fascinating in McCarthy. I mean, it's such a fascinating idea that there's this sort of, and I don't know if this is what he means when he says we are only what we make of God. That's not a statement about whether or not God exists. It's really just a statement of saying we as human beings cannot escape, believer or non-believer, we cannot escape the maybe inevitability or the responsibility of imagining the world as one, or the cosmos as one, right? There's this sort of singularity to things that gives things meaning to us, right? And so we all have certain sentiments or certain assumptions or certain feeling for what the cosmos is, what it might mean. And maybe, you know, some of us derive that just from direct experience. Some of us derive that from experience and from inherited values. Some of us, you know, are on a journey to understand what that is. And some of us decided a long time ago, we know what that is. But I think his point is that that's like a fundamental human need. And if you recognize that, then you sort of you maybe give yourself a little more permission to use that impulse creatively rather than in a damaging way. Because certainly any one of us is capable at any moment of being blind to the reality of someone else because our world didn't include them, right? And there's a wall that just blocks them out, right? And so, you know, our worlds have to undergo constant revision, and part of that is this sort of testing of the world that Billy's doing, and then kind of revising as you know, he's listening to all these storytellers, right? He's not just gaining experience with the wolf. He's just spending his time sitting around talking to desert gurus who have nothing to do with them, not so much time on their hands that they just sit around and say the most incredible things. But I think, you know, I think that there's a lesson in there about sort of, it's not something to bemoan that we're that limited. I think we can't really make sense of the world unless we imagine one, right? One in which everything is connected. Because if it's just chaos, we can't really, things aren't intelligible anymore, and we don't know how to act. But if our worlds never undergo evolution or change or revision, then we're just banging our heads against the wall.
Yeah, let me read the passage from page 158. That was very telling. He says, and this is the priest, the lesson of life can never be its own. Only the witness has power to take its measure. It is lived for the other only.
Mm.
And I think that's lovely in the sense that all storytelling is about the listener and the speaker,
Mm-hmm.
and then the responsibility of passing that on as a
Yeah.
witness. So that it's interesting to me, the teller of the story really has only kind of a limited vantage point about itself. And the teller relies on the witness to complete and transmit the story.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful way of thinking about, you know, transmission of civilization, of knowledge, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's kind of what I see when he says, rightly heard, all stories are one, right? That there's something about I think it's a moral principle for McCarthy that, you know, listening to stories is absolutely vital to our humanity, and is vital to our survival. But that rightly heard requires a lot of things we were talking about, attention being primary, right? Really, really putting oneself aside enough to do that, you know, the kind of deep listening that we value when we experience it, when we're telling something and we're talking to somebody who's really listening, right? We feel, we gain hope and we gain healing often because there's a sense of shared world. We're not cut off and in our own little prison.
Even the blind man who relies on his wife to tell his story, for the most part, you know, even that blind man who has no representation of the outside world, and thinks that the ultimate principle of existence is something unseen, immaterial, he says at one point. Even he, you know, he's the one that lived the story and lived the experience, but he requires a teller to kind of tell his experience. And there's something very social, very there's a very much of a social responsibility when it comes to like world propagating, you know, world continuation. It's a
158 that you had us looking at. Only the witness has power to take its measure. It is lived for the other only. Yeah.
yeah. Which makes me wonder why could a human being carry out the responsibility of witnessing someone's story to an animal? You know, could the dog at the end should that dog have been the recipient of all of the stories that Billy had heard up to that point?
So there's
I
that
don't know.
problem or that advantage for animals. They're not in the prison house of language.
Mm.
But that very Nietzschean prison house of language, in my mind, all that means is that is what we make of God. We make the world through language, and language is contingent, and language is made up of metaphors, and metaphors have power, but let's not pretend that they somehow are any truth other than the truths that we make with our best efforts.
Yeah, there's speaking of another Nobel Prize winner, Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize speech, which is a beautiful reflection on language's limitations, but that language that knows its limitations is powerful language, right? She cites the Gettysburg Address as an example of a language user who says we cannot sum up this war, right? There's no language adequate to what we have just experienced and what we're continuing to experience. And that's precisely why the language is so powerful, is because it acknowledges its limitations. And of course, she compares that to statist and propagandist language that is very intolerant of, or commercial language, right, that is trying to capture reality in its fullness and not wanting you to look behind the curtain to see what, you know, language is hiding, but poetic language is always displaying its weakness, and by displaying its limitations. And yet that, I mean, that's why I think that those descriptions of the wolf are far more powerful to me in many ways than some of the very best nature writing or ecological, biological writing I might read to understand, animal behavior or animal consciousness, precisely because it's so expressive of its inability to understand. And yet I feel like I'm more in the presence of a wolf that way than any other way that could have been possible.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons all three of us uh, love this novel so much is because of its epistemological humility, coupled with the extraordinary assertions it makes. We're able to do both. We're able to realize that this is fiction. That all our sentences are fictions in a way, based as they are on metaphors, but this book knows that,
Yeah.
and every other page reminds us of that, and so then we don't turn to the kinds of absolute sense, the proud senses that we know, and that this is it, and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me ask a question actually read the question of a listener. Jeannie Kammerman asks this. I'll just read it. I had only a short afternoon in the archives reading a draft of Whales and Man. If I remember correctly, the human characters in the play tried to get information, knowledge, wisdom to save the world from the whales. You seem to find the same link or attempted link to the cosmos in The Crossing.
Well, it sounds like Jeannie's read more than I have of the play. So she might have a better understanding than I do. I've read just excerpts from other critics. I didn't go to the trouble of getting to the archives. I was just fascinated by the snippets that I was able to find. So I don't know the whole plot of the screenplay. But if the question is getting at, I think we've been talking about this, that just understanding the nature of a wolf is task enough, right, to try to understand the cosmos. And I do think in a larger sense, in an eco-critical sense, I would say McCarthy is one of those many writers that we have who are trying to help us to understand that our survival depends on our ability to understand the wolf or the whale or the atmosphere or a river, what have you, right? That our journey into understanding the natural world is actually cosmological. It has massive implications for our meaning as human beings and for our ability to survive. And so it's one reason why my book project is sort of really arguing for environmental thinkers to, regardless of where people are in terms of their particular outlooks on, the meaning of life or or life after death or what have you, is to recognize the sort of cosmological ambition or crisis even that we're having in the environmental moment we're in, where we really are having to rethink and rewrite and reimagine the cosmos, right? And what our purpose is and what our role is and what our relationship to one another is, what our relationship to the physical world is, because there's a sort of building consensus that the narratives we've been using are not adequate. They're not doing the job they were supposed to do. Maybe they don't have to be thrown out, but they certainly need to be reconsidered. And that's what a lot of eco-theology is, in fact, doing. It's not throwing out the Christian eco-theologians aren't throwing out the story of Adam and Eve. Pope Francis rereads the story brilliantly in order to make it work for the 21st century in the age of climate change. And that works for people who are of that faith. And lots of other similar kinds of arguments are made in different religious traditions. So, but I think that's what literature is doing too. Literature is, what we call secular literature is fiction and poetry is helping us to reimagine our place in the world in light of present circumstances and give us some grounds for hope. Anyway, that's probably more than she was asking, but
I think that's
I
brilliant.
would like to read the screenplay. I do admit. I mean, I was fascinated by it, and I don't know, can't remember now the details as to why it was never saw the light of day. But apparently, you only spend a very short time in the archives.
Yeah, what you say though does correspond very well with what the priest says about how let's see. You have to go back to what you're saying. There's basically, so the storytelling that we as human beings engage in is needs to be endless. It can't ever stop. And likewise, we need, to tell endless configurations of the one story to the point until it works, until we can make our existence work. So I think what you said was brilliant in terms of a theological telling, I think. Let me go to another question from Karen Anderson. She says, the author strikes me as a John the Baptist figure, calling contemporary men toward a fervently spiritual advent. I know women read Cormac McCarthy too. I have, and I listened to George quote Lydia Cooper, but locating ourselves in his work might require a different strain of attentiveness. Men I admire read McCarthy with a striking quality of passion. If you think I'm making a point worth considering, could both of you speculate on why McCarthy speaks so powerfully to masculine spirituality? Very good question.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Karen. Karen's a friend of mine, a dear friend. Maybe McCarthy has his limits. Surely he has his limits, and maybe he does speak better to men than to women. And I'm trying to think. There's some really interesting women in various novels of the Border trilogy, but I think they're all like Spanish-speaking servants, which doesn't help answer your question very well. And then there's the prima donna, but that's a very masculine scene. As we're in his mind there. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, I think it's one of the biggest limitations of his writing. I mean, I guess some of the obvious reasons why he seems to appeal to masculine spirituality are, that they're mainly masculine characters and protagonists. They're mainly, I don't know, it's actually a version of masculinity that I don't really feel like I have any direct experience with or relationship to. I'm not prone to think of myself as someone who's out fighting the wild or engaging in such physical work or such physically dangerous work. So I'm sure there's a strong element of that, right? I mean, he certainly has revitalized the cowboy myth for the 20th and 21st centuries in ways that are fascinating and not necessarily to be held up as things to celebrate, I guess. I mean, because I do think it's just very lamentable that, and he, you know, I read of the few interviews he did give, he was asked about, you know, why are there so few women in your stories? And his answers are pretty disappointing and inadequate as well. So it's like, well, this guy, you know, just seemed to have lived in a mostly masculine world, although maybe he was guarding certain privacy about matters with his wives or partners, or you know, I don't really know much about his biography, but the little I've seen, um, you know, he definitely comes across as someone who's quite a loner. So it's not, there's sort of the problem of the almost exclusive masculinity of his stories, but also sort of the solitude of them. You know, there's, even though he's celebrating storytelling and listening and compassion, it's like, you know, everybody in his stories has been like, the community has been obliterated, right? And they're just barely holding it together. So it always feels post-apocalyptic, you know, that he's trying to figure out how to piece the world together, but he apparently didn't think you needed to do it with a whole lot of women.
You know,
You
we
know,
do
So
get it.
I don't relate to that, if that makes some sense. I find him fascinating, and I find him inspiring, but I don't see in his fiction as readily as I do in so many other writers the kind of world that I live in.
It's interesting that maybe his most interesting female character is in Stella Maris. Uh, that's a brilliant woman, and it's her
That's fair.
psychoanalysis that's the center of that. But I don't know I don't know who that appeals to or not either. So
one insight might be that McCarthy was strongly influenced by Herman Melville, as George alluded to. And, you know, Moby Dick is really all about some grand metaphysical quest that is very claustrophobic in a male sense.
Yeah.
You
So is
can,
Quixote. Yeah. Yeah.
that's true. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what's interesting to see a bit of a change at the end of his career, McCarthy's career, with Alicia Western in Stella Maris, who is herself on a sort of metaphysical grand quest, or maybe a mathematical grand quest, to kind of find meaning, personal meaning in an impersonal mathematical world. So maybe at the end of his career, he started leaning more towards a more female perspective. But yeah, it's definitely imbalanced.
yeah.
Let's go to another question from anonymous attendee. Hello, thank you all for being here. I have two questions. Number one, what would you think are the biggest examples of compassion for others in McCarthy's work, other than in the Border Trilogy, The Road, and The Passenger in Stella Maris? Suttree's love for his passing child comes to mind when I ask this. So number one, examples of compassion. Number two, do you have anything to add to what you think McCarthy wants to say regarding compassion for others in his work? Compassion for others is sparse in Blood Meridian.
Yeah, for sure. And I recently reread that Looking for the Standing metaphor. It was nowhere to be found, and it's because there's never any and nothing ever stops. There's just killing, 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 and anyway, it's
Yeah, I mean, the questioner took off all the books that I would have used as, for example. So I'm sort of, I'm trying to remember others that I've read. No Country for Old Men, but I don't know that I can pull that many examples. Um, you know, even though The Road was mentioned as one not to cite. I mean, I certainly think the father-son compassion in that novel is, you know, absolutely vital to understanding the whole project. Um, it's a really interesting question, one that I don't have a good answer to.
I mean neither.
It seems like all of the examples of kind of life-affirming hope that bleed out in Cormac McCarthy's works are just that. They're kind of more implied.
And they
Their
bleed out.
background.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pun intended there.
Yeah, right.
So
I
as
mean,
we,
you know, there's sorry, I just quick thought about that. I mean, there's, you know, it's not obvious to a lot of readers, you know, where hope lies in his fiction. I found Blood Meridian the most difficult of all of his books to read. I found it, you know, physically almost difficult to get through. But, you know, he's so determined, right, to test the human limits, to test the limits of something like compassion against a world that refuses to reward it. And there's something, you know, I think he certainly seems to understand maybe about what Jesus was getting at when he was sort of saying, well, love of enemies is really the ultimate test of love. Like loving people who love you doesn't really mean anything. And I think he's sort of getting at that same concept that, you know, morality or compassion or commitment to alleviating suffering, it doesn't mean anything unless we test it against the bleakest of worlds, right? And then we'll find out if it really still holds up. Part of me always suspects that's what he's testing. But it often can feel like he is refusing hope, right? Or that he's constantly disappointing it, right? In order, but I think Billy, at least in this novel, stands as I mean, even his tears at the end of the book are so they're so deeply moving to me and so humbling, you know, that it does make me want to live a compassionate life. You know, I just can't help feel that way at the end of the book.
And that the attempt to bring the prostitute out of, or as in Cities on the Plain, it's obviously naive and impossible and all the rest, but there's a lot of compassion there, and I feel with him even as he's making his bad choices and mistakes.
I think there's a lot of compassion even within the camaraderie that the male figures, you know, experience, especially Cities of the Plain, I think. There's one more question from Jacob Booth. He's following up on this. He says, Blood Meridian is very lacking in compassion, but I think it's interesting that the judge calls out the kids holding clemency in his heart for the heathen as a fatal flaw that doomed the gang's efforts. In the judge's dark worldview, compassion is a weakness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and the kid doesn't do so well at the end because of that. Does he end up in the toilet? Something like
And no spoilers. No.
that. Yeah, I think
You know,
Jacob's right there. Exactly.
yeah. I think the very conclusion of this book, The Crossing, offers some hint of hope in that, I'll just read it. He says, he sat there for a long time, and after a while the east did gray, and after a while the right and God-made sun did rise once again for all and without distinction. And so I think there's this idea of a God-made sun. I mean, George has already talked about this, but the hope in a God-made sun, which is regular, it's impartial, it can be relied upon, and standing in contradistinction to the false human sun. At least there's something about the natural world that can be relied on more so than the human moral world. And just that in and of itself is not necessarily an example of compassion, but it's an example of some kind of affirmation that there is an order that supersedes anything human beings can create. In fact, it reminds me of what the blind man said. He says, it's a beautiful, let me find it. I think it's one of the most beautiful phrases. in the deepest dark of loss, there was a ground. And he's
Yeah.
talking about how even amid the illusions of the world of appearance, ultimately there's a ground beneath all of that. So, and that goes to what I was saying before about how a lot of the affirmation in Cormac McCarthy is implied. It's kind of hidden. It's non-accentuated, but it's really there if you want to pay attention to it.
That blind man, he has his eyes sucked out of his head. That's why he's blind. And that led him to that deep fall that you just cited. It's so powerful. And am I remembering this right? That's anyway. The depth of anguish somehow has led finally to the wisdom. And then if we move to the end, even the depth of anguish that Trinity test announces. And then this, Nathan, this is where you were going with that ending: nature, God, Spinoza's Deus sive natura, and they're hard to tell apart, I think, in McCarthy. But that whatever that is, that will continue. That's hopeful.
I think, and that's that idea of wholeness in a world, right? That even though there's so much chaos and there's so much disorder and there's so much suffering that pertains to physical life, that nature is bringing. Like nature's bringing the sun every morning, but it's also bringing death every day. You know, it's so it's that paradox that we have to live with. But I think for me, it's the beauty of the prose itself, the metaphors, the language, the story, even when it's filled with ugliness or hideousness, there's a kind of, I don't know, I mean, maybe it's a kind of that ancient concept of catharsis, but there's a kind of emboldening of hope that I feel comes from reading very painful literature that is bold enough to look at the really hard things honestly. And that's what I admire about him, is just how unafraid he is to confront the most difficult questions. And his lack of fear is precise. Well, I would say it's a kind of faith. It's a kind of hope in literature, to be able to imagine a world in which these things happen, and yet there's still meaning.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
I was agreeing. That's all.
Mhm.
He said it well.
Yeah. In fact, I think that was probably a good place to conclude our conversation. Any closing ideas to wrap up?
I'm happy to leave it there, but
Yeah.
Scott, if you want to say something.
I think I've said what I wanted to say.
Okay. It does remind me of my favorite quote in All the Pretty Horses, in which the narrator talks about the mindset of John Grady Cole, and he says it's difficult to cite word for word, but he says basically he thought that in the world was hid a secret, and that is beauty is extracted. Beauty comes in the form of a single flower, but it's extracted from a lot of pain. And the vision of that single flower is worth it. So, gentlemen, let's conclude there. I very much appreciate you participating in this panel discussion. It's been wonderful, enlightening. It's deepened our minds and our hearts, and we should do this again sometime.
All right.
Lots of fun. Thank you, Nathan. Thanks,
Yeah.
Scott.
Thanks. We'll see everyone next time.